Hi, I'm G. Welcome back to my art channel, and today I'm having a little look at Faber Castell's Albrecht Durer watercolor pencils. It'll be my first go with them. So after I was able to get into the sturdy tin, I was confronted by the pencils and a couple of little leaflets. One was a really cool booklet which had some wet and dry techniques and a little bit of history in it. And the other one was a bit of a promo for their larger type of pencils, the Magnus pencils. And straight off the bat, these looked pretty good. But looks can be deceiving, so I'll go into depth and have a little bit more of a look at them. On the back, you've got various bits of instructions in lots of different languages, and in English, this is what it was telling you. Acid-free pigments in the pencils, fully water-soluble, and a high break resistance due to secural bonding. Sounds like a bit of German engineering going on there. And on the bottom of the back was something that really impressed me. It talked about each one of the pencils' light fastness. Not something I'd seen on a pack of watercolor pencils before. So here you go, I'm looking at the pencils now and you can see they look pretty nice quality, embossed with that kind of silver. And when I compared them to my Derwent pencils, they looked a little bit thicker. So that might actually make them a little bit easier to grip. So after breaking them out of the tin, one of the first things I want to do is a colour swatch so I can see what they look like on watercolour paper. So here you can see me going in and using the colours on 300 GSM watercolour paper, and I'm basically adding a sort of like half colour into a square and then adding water with a soft sable brush here to mix water with the colour and sort of gradually get us a kind of a dark to light in each of the squares. And at this early stage, I could really tell that they were very, very reactive with the water. I was basically just getting the sable brush with some water on it, popping it on top of the pigment, and it would react instantly, allowing me to really push that colour around each of the squares in a really nice, bright, but easy kind of manner. And with the swatch pretty much done, I was able to compare and look at all the colours that I had. And it had a decent amount of yellows to oranges, couple of reds, good amount of blues and greens. And also I was impressed by a couple of warm greys that were included as well. Next, I thought I'd try them out on some different papers. So I thought I'd use basic average printer paper, then some very smooth Bristol Board, and then hot press watercolour and cold press watercolour, and I would try and do exactly the same thing on each one. So here you can see me laying down a really, really thick amount of dark green colour, and my test here is to see if I put the colour on very, very thickly, when I add water, would it start to get that kind of greasy quality that I've always found watercolor pencils have in the past when you apply a lot of pigment, a lot of color in one particular place. And I have to say I was really, really impressed with the results here. Not only were they good on Bristol Board, but on the watercolor paper, the water reacted so well with the pigment that it didn't really feel as though it had that kind of greasy quality that I'm used to with watercolor pencils. So already I was like, My next test was to press down really hard in each of the papers and see if I could actually get rid of those marks by brushing with water on top of the paper. So I used a red and I did pretty much exactly the same kind of pressure as best as I could on each one of the papers, and then used the brush to try and blend them in. And I thought I'd even weigh it in my favour here using a slightly stiffer synthetic brush to try and blend those colours in. So you can see me working every single one of them with a good blob of water, really trying to dissolve and get all of that pigment to react and blend in with the water. And I've got to be honest, even though I tried really hard with the watercolor papers, there was still a kind of a faint, and you should be able to see it, a faint mark visible. But that was kind of to be expected. The next thing that I did was try to blend two colors together. So you can see me laying down some blue and fading it out, and then the same with the yellow. And then I'm adding water to the blue and working it back and forth into the yellow. So I get a sort of blue, light green, yellow effect, or at least that's what I was trying to do to see if the colors would mix or blend well when I put them on the paper together. And I'm feeling a little sorry for the printer paper because it's pretty much struggling with everything I've tried so far. But the Bristol Board was surprisingly good. And of course, when I got onto the hot press watercolor paper and then the cold press, those two blended very, very satisfyingly. And as I kind of expected they would do, but they blended together beautifully to give me those greens. Next, I put an application of water onto each of the papers. So I was going to try drawing into paper that was damp or paper that was wet. So here you can see me just laying the same amount of water from a nice big fat sable brush onto each of the papers and then drawing into the top with the magenta pencil just to see how they would react. And I've got to be honest, I kind of expected it to pretty much go with cold press to be the most reactive on this one. And that is how it sort of turned out. As you can see, as I put on the cold press, which is the far right paper on this page, you can see it beginning to spread out and blend out into the water that soaked into the top. I think somebody told me that also cold press colors tend to stay on the surface, whereas with hot press, I think they can be absorbed more. I'm not sure if that's completely true or not, but that would kind of explain why probably cold press seemed to be the most reactive. So after the magenta, I went over the damp paper, just adding some little bits of scarlet red as well to see how they would react. And again, on the watercolor papers, they seem to get that lovely fuzzy soft edge as it reacted with the water on the paper a lot more easily than the first two. My next experiment was to try layering colours on top of one another. So you can see me just putting down a base layer of yellow onto each of the papers, which I then use a brush to activate and give a basic sort of like watercolour yellow. Once I got the watercolor yellow, then I decide that I'm going to go over that with another color and see if I get the effect of those two colors layering on top and creating a new color. That's the plan. So I get the yellow down and then I put a few strokes of scarlet red just over half of the yellow, so you'll be able to compare one side to the other. So I'm hoping that once I activate the red and blend that in a little, it will give me red on top of yellow and create a sort of an orange effect. That is the plan. So printer paper didn't go so well. Bristol Board didn't blend as much as I was hoping, so I really pinned my hopes on the hot press and the cold press, and they did a lot better. The pigment of the pencils blended a lot better and allowed me to create these patches of color on top of the yellow, which did appear more like they had an orange feel to them. And my last little experiment with the papers was to reactivate the color that was already there. So I've got like basic just clean water on the brush here, and I'm going back over the green color at the top and brushing it with that clean water to see if that pigment will pick up and reactivate. This is something I do with watercolor paints themselves sometimes, so I would like it if it's able to do this. If it's more permanent, that would be a bit of a drawback perhaps, but I've got to say, as we moved along and we got to the hot press and the cold press, and I brushed them, I think, for about the same amount of time as the first two papers, it was very, very nice, and it showed a nice reactive effect, and I thought, oh, that's cool, I can use that, I can work with that. So if it's time for pros and cons, and I'll go with the pros first, and I've got to say my number one was how easily reactive these colour pencils were. They were brilliant. You just had to put a bit of colour down and then add a little bit of water with synthetic or a sable brush, and it would just react straight away, and you could just move that colour around with the brushes. I was kind of surprised because usually with watercolour pencils I've found that I've got to work them a little bit more with a brush to get them to actually react, but these were super reactive just by themselves. One of the other things is, and if you've seen the swatch in the video, you'll know that it was the super bright colours. There were a range of good bright colours in this set of 24, and they had a bunch of nice yellows, reds, blues, greens. Perhaps with only one magenta kind of purple, they could have done with a few more purples, but I guess you could mix those using your reds and blues if you wanted to. Really nice range of browns and some sort of browns and greys near the end there as well. They were also remarkably good on different papers. Printer paper aside, which is pretty bad with most watercolor pencils, they were really good on the Bristol Board. They were terrific on the hot press and the cold press papers. So these worked very good on I felt a small range of papers, but on the watercolor papers, you definitely saw the best out of them. And they didn't seem to go greasy with a very heavy or thick application. Now, I've found that with some watercolor pencils before, and if you've watched some of my other videos, you know that's how I feel about them. But these, you saw it in the video, I put a big, thick application of color down there. But it was good. It didn't seem too greasy when I added water to it, and it actually seemed to work really, really well to get a dark or bolder, brighter shade. So, cons. I was thinking I'd have to talk about the price because these are about £33 in Britain for a set of 24. But actually, when I did a little bit of digging and looked at some other sets of watercolor pencils, They were pretty much about the same price for the same amount. I'm talking Caran d'Ache, I'm talking Derwent watercolor pencils, I'm talking Prismacolor. For around about 24 colors, they were almost the same kind of price point, around the sort of early to mid £30 GB sterling. The colors were quite bright compared to perhaps some other watercolor pencils, and by that I mean when you pick up, for instance, I've used the Derwent ones quite a bit. They have a slightly more muted, earthy feel to the colors without being like super bright. And I felt as though maybe they just had the edge in terms of slightly more realistic and earthy colors. The Faber Castell ones were very bright, but again, I'd have to use them a bit more to make sure that I could get some nice realistic earth tones rather than super bright kind of earth tones. But that was pretty much it. I've got to say, I was a big fan of them, and I can definitely say that I'm going to use them some more, and I'm looking forward to doing some flower paintings and maybe some paintings of other things using these watercolor pencils.